a very important step in the historical process of the modernization of the British parliamentary monarchy was the constitutional crisis that took place between 1909 and 1911. Now, just one remark about this term constitutional crisis. It illustrates the fact that there was a major conflict at the head of British politics, of the British political system, that led to a major change in how the British parliamentary regime worked. But it's important to remember that there has never been a written constitution that would explain how the British monarchy should function. This is a very different element if we compare the British system to the French system. The French often wrote constitutions, and I think this is linked to the fact that political changes in the 19th century, but not only, often took the shape of a revolution. So the constitution, the written text, that was some kind of a sacred text, was here to give some strength, some legitimacy to the new regime. There's nothing like this that happened in the British historical history. Because for the British, it is the weight of tradition that gives its strength and legitimacy to the parliamentary system. So we speak about a constitutional crisis even though there was never a written constitution. And so what the historical legacy had given to the early 20th century Britain was this British Parliament, located in the Palace of Westminster, that was divided, like many other parliaments in the world by the way, between two houses. The upper chamber, so historically the first one, was the House of Lords, also known as the House of Peers. It is the first house that was created during the Middle Ages, during an event that was called Magna Carta under the reign of King John I. And so the lords of the kingdom got together and chose to have this house in order to influence the decisions made by the king. It was the beginning of the British Parliament. Now a bit later, another chamber, known as lower chamber, was added, called the House of Commons. So the lords represented the traditional elite of the country, basically the aristocracy, and the commons represented the British nation in a more general way. But it was absolutely not democratic at the beginning of the 19th century. So we saw how the franchise enlarged during the 19th century. It's because the members of parliament in the commons are elected, okay? But they were not elected by all the population, but they were elected. On the contrary, the lords were only appointed, and their nomination was based on two main principles. You were a lord for life, and this title was hereditary. Consequently, the upper chamber was absolutely undemocratic, and it was meant to be like this. Okay, so extremely stable, with the same old aristocratic families represented in the House of Lords. During the 19th century, the power of the upper chamber had slightly decreased, while that of the lower chamber had increased. But the Lord could still veto any law. So, election at the national level, election of the House of Commons, normally took place every 5 years. The 1906 general election was very, very important. Because the Liberal Party, so central left, the more pro-democracy party, won a landslide victory. Indeed, it won 397 constituencies. Okay, this is how the map of the United Kingdom was divided. Every constituency elects one MP. The consequence of this is that the Liberal got 397 seats in the House of Commons, and so the government could be a government of Liberal ministers. So this is what we call a landslide victory. It is how those very, very large victories are named. So here was the new government. It was after 1 year with an old prime minister who died. It was really a cabinet which consisted of young politicians, new politicians who were determined to modernize the British system. Prime Minister was Herbert Asquith, and almost as important as him was his Chancellor of the Exchequer, David Lloyd George. Chancellor of the Exchequer is the title given to the Minister of Economy and Finance. And by the way, if the office of Prime Minister is 10 Downing Street, that of the Chancellor is 11 Downing Street, which really shows how they form a kind of duet at the head of British politics. And the Deputy Chancellor, who worked with David Lloyd George, was a young politician that would remain very famous and become more famous a bit later, Winston Churchill, okay, Home Secretary in 1910, the equivalent of Minister of the Interior in France. So, okay, these three men, they were really determined to change things significantly in Britain, not only regarding politics, but also regarding social issues. Indeed, the reason why they had been elected and the reason why they were working so hard, okay, in government was because they had a very, very ambitious program of social reforms. This issue was known as the People's Budget. Here it is. They were determined to increase the role of the state in dealing with the demands of the working class. Okay, we saw that there was this rise of the working class in British society, and their living conditions and working conditions were very difficult. So the idea that the state had to play a role in helping the people, in distributing wealth in the country a bit more fairly, was an idea that increased. This is why the Liberals had won this election. They had to, so the government should have to spend a lot of money on solidarity, on social issues, but also it had to give a lot of money to the military, because at that moment, at the international level, tensions were very high as well. So the only solution was to increase significantly the taxes on the rich, and notably the taxes on the property of land. And for this reason, the old aristocracy, represented by the Conservative Party, was really determined to block the People's Budget and to make that it would never be passed in the end. So this is the reason why, when the People's Budget was proposed by the government, there was no problem for the Commons to vote it, because the Commons were mostly liberals. But the House of Lords completely rejected it, and in those days the House of Lords could veto a law. It meant that he could say no forever to a law, and so the situation was a dead end. As a consequence, the Liberals believed that there was only way to obtain the People's Budget. It was to change things in the House of Lords. And so they started a propaganda campaign against the House of Lords. For example, David Lloyd George said, "There are just 500 men chosen accidentally from among the unemployed." Okay, so everything was done to show and to convince the people in Britain, well, in fact, they were already largely convinced of that for many of them, that the House of Lords was something of the past, totally undemocratic, that only represented the very, very, very rich. And so the Prime Minister introduced this idea. Let's add 500 new Liberal peers, means 500 new lords that would belong to the Liberal Party, and so that would vote in favor of the People's Budget. Peers means lords, by the way. But for such an important reform, he needed the agreement of the king. But old King Edward VII, even though he was not very interested in politics, he was a very, very, very traditional man, a very traditional aristocrat. And so his answer was very clear. There was absolutely no chance that he would accept this. So the only thing Prime Minister Asquith could do was to call a new general election and really convince the people that the issue of this election would be either the people's budget and a decrease in the power of the House of Lords, or the victory of the old aristocracy, and Britain would never change. Election was to take place in January 1910. And really, the people were listening to the arguments of the liberals, because this was really what the debate was about. Now, it's like every time a party is at the head of government for a certain time, it's difficult to be as popular as in the beginning. And so the consequence of this is that the general election of January 1910 was not a landslide victory of the liberals. But it was a short victory, and a victory anyway, a very important one. Because, in fact, two other parties were also in favor of the people's budget, and they were opposed to the Conservatives. The Irish Parliamentary Party in Ireland, which mostly consisted of people that wanted more autonomy for Ireland, and also in red, the new, very left-wing Labour Party, which supported the working class. By the way, we can have a quick look at the geography of British politics at that moment, because it did not really change later, actually. You can see that the areas which mostly voted Conservatives were the southwest of Britain, so what we call Green England, where you have no major manufacturing industries, while the constituencies that voted Liberals in those days, and increasingly that voted Labour, were the regions where you had an industrial manufacturing sector. Okay, so cities like Liverpool and regions like the south of Wales. Why is Northern Ireland all blue? It is because in Northern Ireland, this is where you had most of the Protestant Irish who absolutely did not want a separation with the UK, and so they voted Conservative for this reason. So anyway, thanks to this victory, the people's budget was passed. But Asquith was determined to change the rules in the constitution, or in the British political system, and so he reintroduced his idea to add 500 new liberal peers. And one thing changed during the year 1910. The old king died. And his young successor, King George V, was more interested in reform. And so he said, okay, why not? But only if the liberals can win another election. So Asquith said, well, okay, let's try it. And in December 1910, there was a second general election in the same year. And the result of this second election, well, mostly confirmed what had happened at the beginning of the year. There was still a majority in favor of reform. At this moment, Asquith could say to the House of Lords, now it's either you accept the introduction of 500 new lords that would be in favor of reform, or you accept this. You accept the Parliament Act, which was an act that would reduce the power of the House of Lords without changing the number of lords. And so debate took place inside the House of Lords, but in reality, after a long debate, it was impossible for them to say something else than, well, okay. And so the Parliament Act was passed. Now the House of Lords had no more right of veto on any money bill, so every budget would pass. And if they wanted to veto a law, they could only do that for 2. Consequence of this, now at the head of British politics, the House of Commons really led the way. It was a more democratic parliament, even though we must remember that it was not yet a really democratic system, because the Commons were only elected by 30% of the adults.